We are studying Sri Aurobindo's chapter titled The Realization of the Cosmic Self, in which he discusses how we have to re-establish the right relation with the world from a consciousness established in the self. Earlier, in the previous chapters, the focus was on the release from the ego, where step by step we disengaged from what was earlier a false identification with the body, with the life energies, the emotions, the mind, and then whatever remains of a sense of separateness, and turn our consciousness entirely to dwell upon the one and the infinite. At that time, he specified our goal is to realize the divine not only in the highest, but also in the widest. And so, having attained to some experience of the self, of the Brahman, in the direction of or in the consciousness of the Absolute, from there, he says, our second aim is to establish now the true relation between this eternal self that we are and the changing world around us, with which we had a wrong relation. As long as we are inside the changing world, identified with the body, life energies or mind, it is very difficult to establish a right relation with the world, because we ourselves are not true. Having first put ourselves in the poise of the self, we have a foundation of something that is real. So he says, if there has to be now a new real relationship with the world, it has to be on the basis of two realities. You can't have reality having a real relationship with a false appearance. So we have now to recover the truth of the world, and from the consciousness of the self, establish the true relationship with the truth of the world. So here in the discussion which we already read last time, there are very important ideas. One of them is this recognition that while we were in the body consciousness, in the mind, in the ego sense, when we tried to think of the self or the divine, it was something distant, remote, almost unreal. Equally, as we enter the self, and especially with an exclusive focus, from there when you look upon the world, it seems distant, unreal, almost illusory. As unreal, perhaps even more than from this poise. It may seem at first a contradiction. How can, seen from there, this world appear to be more unreal? And the reason is simple, because you are rooted in something that is real. Against the experience of something so concrete, so real, self-existent, massive, infinite, one, you turn upon the world and you find this fragmented, vague, unformed multiplicity floating as if like an apparition, like a mirage. Especially because you are rooted in a reality, this seems more unreal. Whereas when you were in the physical consciousness and you looked towards that, it seemed unreal, vague, well, because you couldn't feel it. But this itself is innately unreal, and therefore the contrast is not as great. You will recall from our study of Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Isha Upanishad, the text of the Isha says that when we enter the pursuit of the consciousness of division, that is this consciousness of multiplicity of the world, we enter a darkness when we pursue it exclusively. But then it says, if we pursue the oneness of the divine exclusively, then we enter a greater darkness. And Sri Aurobindo explains why. Because in the nature of the world's reality, everything is kicking you, hitting you, hurting you, shocking you to break from the false identification. I thought this was my best friend. I thought this was the most reliable thing. I thought the bank account was safe. I thought my body was young. Eventually it hits you, it kicks you, and painfully causes a kind of a withdrawal, a shrinking, a breaking of that exclusive dependence on anything in the world. It pushes you back towards something deeper, truer, essential one. Whereas when you enter the other extreme exclusively, and the key word here is exclusively, when you enter the oneness of the self exclusively, that being so real, so complete, so overwhelming, there is nothing there to push you back. And so entry into that exclusively is a greater darkness than entry into the consciousness of division exclusively. And we have now a sense, we can understand why it is easy for yogis, having attained a great spiritual realization, to get swayed, to get carried away with the sense of illusoriness of the world. We have this wrong idea that once you have attained to self-realization, then everything is there anyway, everything will be right, you will always have right knowledge. It need not be true, because the self has many aspects or modes. And we can enter into one aspect of the self and lock ourselves into it exclusively, and thereby lose out the rest of it and not even realize that we have lost it. And that's why this background is so important. So Sri Aurobindo comments here that in such an exclusive withdrawal, we have leaped from the pure mind to pure spirit without treading the stairs from this middle to the summit. The mind is described as the middle region in the stairway of consciousness. But the recovery of the right relationship with the world must be based on something. Because when the world appears so illusory, so vague, so fickle, what is it that links this pure, absolute oneness of self with this multiplicity of the world's appearance? Something has to be there which is real, which can be the basis for our reconnection with the world. And so Sri Aurobindo points now to the key principle. He says, the principle that links the eternal unity between the self and all existences, this unity which is there. Recall that this whole world is born out of the self, of Brahman. And therefore there is in the self something which knows the whole world, something which supports the whole world, and is even connected with an underlying unity with the whole world. And this is the principle to be caught. And so Sri Aurobindo builds the whole further development of our practice upon this foundation, this truth. So he writes, this is the portion we read last time, for integral self-possession, we must be one not only with the self, with God, but with all existences. We must take back in the right relation and in the poise of an eternal truth the world of our manifested existence, peopled by our fellow beings, from which we had drawn back because we were bound to them in wrong relation and in the poise of a falsehood created in time by the principle of divided consciousness. Because we were in that false condition of division, therefore we had to break out of that false relationship. And now we have to re-establish the true relation. So how? We have to take back all things and beings into our new consciousness, but as one with all, not divided from them by an egoistic individuality, where earlier this is not I. Because it is not I can have the sense of holding it, owning it, possessing it, or losing it. But I don't have the same sense when I am aware that I am conscious. I do not have any sense of possessing my consciousness. I simply am conscious. I cannot lose my consciousness. I simply am it. There's nothing which can tear it away. And so there's no question of getting it, owning it, or losing it. But the moment there's a separation, then all these things become not only possible, they become inevitable. And with that points all oppositions, discords, and dualities. So now when we come to this question of how to take back all things and beings into our new consciousness, Sri Aurobindo discusses the perspective offered in the Isha Upanishad. In a single explanation, Sri Aurobindo does two things. First, he gives you the means, but at the same time he shows you that this means is not in contradiction with the highest or greatest spiritual realizations of the past. Otherwise, what we are discussing now will be denied by many of the conventional religious or even spiritual figures who have attained great realizations. They will say, no, what you're chasing is a figment of imagination. The world is unreal or domain of suffering or something to be left behind in pursuit of the self. And so Sri Aurobindo takes care not only to articulate what he needs to say, but also to show that this is the very foundation of all of the greatest spiritual traditions. So, in other words, besides the consciousness of the transcendent self, pure, self-existent, timeless, spaceless, we have to accept and become the cosmic consciousness. We have to identify our being with the infinite, who makes himself the base and continent of the worlds and dwells in all existences. This is the realization which the ancient Vedantins spoke of as seeing all existences in the self and the self in all existences. And in addition, they speak of the crowning realization of the man in whom the original miracle of existence has been repeated. Self-being has become all these existences that belong to the worlds of the becoming. So here he lists the three realizations discussed in the Isha Upanishad. And in these three terms, he says, the whole of the real relation between the self and the world is captured, which has to now substitute what we had as the false relation created by the limiting sense of ego. And he concludes this paragraph with, this is the new vision and sense of infinite being which we have to acquire. This, the foundation of that unity with all, which we have to establish. Now it may seem strange. A person has attained to the realization of the absolute, realization of the self, realization of the one, has gone not only into nirvana but beyond nirvana, has gone into realization of the bliss of Brahman. And after that, when everyone says, oh, you have reached the highest peak, after that, Sri Aurobindo says, we have now to acquire this, and we have now to establish this. And it seems strange. But it is from this perspective that Sri Aurobindo comments that my yoga begins where other yogas end. While for most of the existent traditional systems of yoga, the goal is to realize the self, the Brahman, the Absolute, and lose yourself in that. Sri Aurobindo says it is after that now that this real work begins. And we have not yet spoken of transformation. We are only speaking of re-establishing the right relation. And he says here, this is the new vision and sense of infinite being which we have to acquire. And the foundation of that unity with all which we have to establish. So this triple experience is the vision and the sense of infinite being. We have to work for it. And the unity will be established on this. Doesn't it happen automatically? And Sri Aurobindo clarifies here, it does not happen necessarily. And especially because we have concentrated on an exclusive realization from the beginning. If right at the beginning we started with this objective and we did not aim at an exclusive realization, then perhaps this may happen gradually, increasingly, completely by the time we attain to realization of the self. And so this will be the discussion in the portion we read today. How to practice realization of the self and the realization of the oneness with the world at the same time, as a double movement in our daily practice. That will be the theme ahead. But also there's a second reason, and that is, having got to that realization of the self, when now you turn upon the world, there is a tendency for the old movements to come up. After all, when I am in the state of trance, immersed in self, my body is quiet, my energies are quiet, even my mind has fallen into some kind of stupor or silence. And then from there, when I turn back to look upon the world and begin to re-engage with things of the world, my means of re-engagement are these triple vehicles of mind, life and body. And the moment I activate them, all their old tendencies now start coming up like a cloud, a dust cloud rising and screening what was earlier my clear true vision. And so there is a necessity to purify or train these parts. So this is the paragraph now that we begin, a portion of which we had read last time. For our real self is not the individual mental being that is only a figure, an appearance. Our real self is cosmic, infinite. It is one with all existence and the inhabitant of all existences. The self behind our mind, life and body is the same as the self behind the mind, life and body of all our fellow beings. And if we come to possess it, we shall naturally, when we turn to look out again upon them, tend to become one with them in the common basis of our consciousness. So as we have entered the self and then we turn to look upon all beings, it is the same self in all of them. So at first it seems like it begins to happen naturally. It is true that the mind opposes any such identification. And if we allow it to persist in its old habits and activities, it will rather strive to bring again its veil of dissonances over our new realization and possession of self, than to shape and subject itself to this true and eternal vision of things. So if you let it be, The mind, as it becomes more and more active, will tend to bring back its old divided perspective. It will oppose this identification of the oneness, which would have happened otherwise naturally. And so there has to be an effort. The mind is going to resist, it is going to oppose, it is going to resist being recast in terms of this vision. Now again, it may seem a little strange for us, but if we only observe how sticky the mind is, we will see that we find it so difficult to switch perspectives, even when dealing with people of a different culture. Somebody else comes with a different value system. Let's say, in a culture where the collectivity comes first, as opposed to a culture where the individual comes first. When one traverses this to the other, everybody is speaking the same language, perhaps even they're dressing similarly, but when it comes to behavior between us, suddenly we find there is a dissonance. I don't understand why you're doing this, or I don't understand why you're not doing this. And there is a conflict. And it is explained, or you see in your culture, these are the values, in my culture, these are the values. And I understand, but it doesn't make sense. Why would you want to do that? And the mind has such a hard time shifting from such a small position of change. Another example, especially with the physical mind, would be simply to recognize that when you open upwards, you look up at the sky, you have the sense that the sky is above you, the earth is below you. But now in your mind, you can shift your perspective, recognize, well, right now we are 12 degrees from the equator. So if you look at the earth in this way, the north pole above, pole below, we are standing like this in space. Okay, so the sky is on the side, the feet are pointing to the earth on the other side. Or mentally consider the picture going the other way. The earth is below you and the earth is above you and the sky is below you. Can you switch your mind like that? And if you try it out for a while, you struggle, and sometimes it just snaps. Yes, I can feel it. The earth is above, sky is below. And for a moment, you are a little out of kilt. And then you get back to your normal routine, snap, the mind comes back to the old perspective. The mind has its own elasticity. You can stretch it a little bit. Some people have a more elastic mind, some people have a less elastic mind. But still, when you stretch it to a new poise, it tends to snap back. And if for such small shifts we have to struggle to retain, consider the perspective of the self, where all things are part of a single oneness. And as my consciousness re-engages with the mind creates like a screen. In a sense, the part of me that is in the experience of the self never loses it. But when I engage with things in the world, I am more active in the surface instruments of the mind, life, body. And in that part, it's a screen that comes back. And perhaps a shock may remind me of the truth behind, I break away. Or I may not lose myself completely in this erroneous old habit, and I may simply stand back, engage briefly, stand back. But eventually I have to reshape my mind, recast it to accept this view and live in it. Mind should not be screening self, but should be revealing perspective and vision of the self. And so Sri Aurobindo gives you means to do that. And further, a whole exercise on how to work on both aspects simultaneously in the daily practice of the yoga. But in the first place, he says, if we have proceeded rightly on the path of our yoga, we shall have attained to self through a purified mind and heart. And a purified mind is one that is necessarily passive and open to the knowledge. Remember, well before we discussed the release from the ego, there was a whole discussion on the preparation and the purification of the different parts of our being. And the purification of the mind involved in particular stilling the mind and disengaging it from its entanglement with the emotions, with the life energies and their desires, and with the sense mind in the physical consciousness. That the mind should be able to stand back from all these things, free from their mixtures, and rightly judge and assess all the data that comes from the senses, from the life energies, from the emotions. And in a stilled state, when it views dispassionately, then it can accept, reject, and put in the right place, arrange in the right proportions. And when the mind has been prepared like this, and now it receives this new vision of the self and the sense of infinite being which remains, then the mind can easily accept this. Ah yes, this is the greater truth. And even accept joyfully, almost like a release, a relief. Sri Aurobindo uses these two words, new vision and sense of infinite things, the sense of infinite being. It's important to dwell on why he has used both. New vision is the active way in which we see. I look at the flower and I have the sense, this is in the oneness of the self. That everything is in the oneness of self. It is the one self which is in all things. And I'm looking at it, perceiving this. But in the seeing, I'm still seeing flower. I have the sense of the self behind, in which the flower floats, which inhabits the flower. And so that's the other aspect, the sense of infinite being, which may not be part of the physical perception, which may not be part of the emotional direct experience, but it is there as if behind, supporting and filling my physical perception, filling my emotional relations, filling my thinking. So the sense of infinite being is something which remains like a backdrop supporting, and the new vision is what fills straight away. When we are deep in activity that involves a narrow focus, let's say I'm sculpting a statue, and my entire focus has to be on the chisel and the hammer and the form of the statue, to the exclusion practically of all else. At that point, in the new vision, I may still dwell upon the idea of all this existing in the sense of, in the oneness of self. But behind the sense of infinite being is always present, even when I don't turn attention to it. My attention may be on something very narrow and specific, but this sense of infinite being supports. And the moment I release my narrow focus, it is there, it never left. It is in this way that it is possible to be fully engaged even in narrow focus without losing that underlying experience. It continues as a living presence and force. And the mind, if it has been sufficiently purified, it is passive and open to this higher knowledge. Knowledge in this case, not informational knowledge, but the experiential knowledge of this sense of oneness, sense of infinity. So this is the first benefit or advantage that we have. Second, which we have to do, we have to make effort for. Secondly, even the mind, in spite of its tendency to limit and divide, can be taught to think in the rhythm of the unifying truth instead of the broken terms of the limiting appearance. it will continue to limit. It will continue to have this tendency to divide. Not only because it has been the habit for so many, let's say, millions of years. After all, the substance of my mind is still the same universal mind consciousness. But more so because that was its original purpose. The mind was created in the divine being as that status of consciousness which sees divisions, divides, separates. So its swadharma, its innate truth of being is to see things in terms of division. But he says it can be taught to think in the rhythm of the unifying truth instead of the broken terms of the limiting appearance. Now his wording is so precise. When we dwell upon it, we will find extraordinary insights here. The mind tends to see in terms of broken truths of limiting appearance. This is limited piece. That is another limited piece. I call this one flower, I call this another flower. They clash, they resist, they oppose each other. One breaks the other if I smash them together. I see limiting appearance and cutting off. This is broken from the tree. This is broken from the stem. Everything is a piece separate. Everything is limited to its broken appearance, like pieces of a jigsaw. But you notice, when you're arranging the jigsaw puzzle, you take a piece, and in your mind, although you see this first as a piece, in your mind you put focus on the picture behind of which this is a piece. And in your mind, you are picturing the full image, and then trying to see, where does this fit? Yes, this must be somewhere in the top right, and I place it there. I look at another piece, broken apparently. When I look at the image in the mind, I'm bringing back the full picture and finding its right relation. And so in this way, although it is habituated to this broken term of limiting appearance, it can be taught to think in the rhythm of the unifying truths. That there is a unifying truth underlying. The unifying truth is not monotone, it is rhythmic. It pulses out. It has waves. And within one giant wave, it has many multiple subwaves. And within those waves, it has other ripples. And this flower is a tiny ripple of a larger wave that was tree, which is itself a wave of a larger wave that was mountain, which is wave of a larger planet, which is wave of a larger galaxy. And I look at this, and I see it no more as this little piece separate, but the picture behind which unifies it in the puzzle. I see this as part of this rhythmic movement of waves. I see this flower as an outburst of the divine energy that flowered out, and the flowering movement completes by dispersing itself and spreading out. It's only a wave of the divine consciousness bursting and continuing. The flower did not fade out, it completed its waves cycle, intended waves cycle. And I cannot freeze it, I cannot stop it. It is part of the wave, and I appreciate the wave as it rises to become flower and as it falls to disperse in fading of the flower. This is another wave, and the two waves now are part of a larger underlying unity. And this becomes for the mind very quickly the underlying reality as we begin to dwell upon it. And so he says, secondly, even the mind, in spite of its tendency to limit and divide, can be taught to think in the rhythm of the unifying truths instead of the broken terms of the limiting appearance. We must therefore accustom it. So now you have to train the mind to get used to this way of looking at it. And how will we do that? By meditation and concentration. To cease to think of things and beings as separately existent in themselves, and rather to think always of the One everywhere, and of all things as the One. One with a capital O. So the One is now, he's using a single term, but depending on the particular orientation of our consciousness, that term has many meanings. When, for example, I look at the flower, from a purely mental frame of mind, I will see this as a form expression of the underlying unity of energy, the One, everywhere, and all things as the One. It's formed out of that form of energy, whirling, playing, expressing itself. If my approach is more through the heart, and the bhakti experience has been an underlying tendency, then I see this as an expression of the bliss, the joy of the divine consciousness, the One, and a burst of its delight which forms this form of the appearance of the flower. And I dwell on the One, but with my heart participating in the love, in the delight of the play. If my orientation is much more in the line of action, of consecrated action in the Karma Yoga, then I see this flower itself as the consecration of the tree's effort, offering itself to the divine. The flower itself is existing to serve and offer itself to the divine. And whether I place it here as an offering to the divine, or at the feet of a statue, or an image, or in the hand of the statue, it is my way of offering to fulfill this movement. And everything is working as a movement of consecration to the One, emerging from the One, pouring back into the One. And so when Sri Aurobindo uses just this one term, very generic, he's capturing all these possibilities of multiple experience when we dwell on the One. So, we must therefore accustom by meditation and concentration to cease to think of things as beings as separately existent in themselves. They don't exist by themselves. They exist only as part of a larger unity. Otherwise they couldn't exist. And rather to think always of the One everywhere and of all things as the One. Now, two words he has used, meditation and concentration. What do you mean by these two things? Why are there two terms used? In the normal vocabulary of the English language, meditation is a dwelling in thought. And so what we discussed earlier was closer to meditation. I'm aware that this is an expression of the tree, offering itself, offering its joy, of the life force in the tree, forming this form of material substance, pouring itself out into the universal One. And I'm thinking of it, dwelling on this idea, and there's a movement of my thought going in this direction. And we will call that a meditation. But a concentration is holding a perception, holding a state of or experience. I glimpse this as a form of the oneness, and I hold that idea. I stay intent holding that state. Or I have a perception of the One everywhere and the One playing in all things, and I hold this state and I see all things as formed of this underlying form of the delight, the energy, the play of the One. And I stay in that. Whether a meditation involving the mind wandering, dwelling upon the sense of the One, or a concentration, it is by remaining in state that we accustom the mind to think like this. You will recall Ramana Maharshi's famous statement that he attained to self-realization in 3 days, but it took him 10 years to fix that perception of the self in all activities without exception. It took him 10 years to fix that. Otherwise, in the deep concentration inwards, one is in the self, one comes out and the experience of the self is there in the backdrop, gradually receding. Once I start talking to people, it fades out more and more. When I go to sleep and wake up, I have lost it. And so, bit by bit, there is this exercise of dwelling on the idea of the one everywhere. And then, even as I am working, and he used to cut vegetables, preparing food for all those who came to his home, his ashram. Even as he's doing that, he's dwelling on the sense of the one. Even as he's gazing out on the scenery from the mountain, it is dwelling on the sense of the one. He looked at people, it is in that. He now engages in conversation, and the sense of the one begins now to infuse itself in this activity, bit by bit, thus extending into all activities. Until eventually, even in sleep state, there is only the withdrawal of the consciousness into the one and the emergence from the one into a different expression of the one. The oneness is never lost. The self is constant. And so when he was about to leave his body, one of the disciples plaintively said, Maharishi, please don't leave us. And his simple response, where can the self go? When you are in the self, where can the self go? Self is here, everywhere, at the same time. So this becomes, as you practice and the mind gets accustomed, the instrument through which we are engaging with the world now becomes more and more filled with this experience, reflecting the truth of the self which fills it. Although we have spoken hitherto of the withdrawing motion of the jiva as the first necessity of knowledge, and as if it were to be pursued alone and by itself, yet in fact, it is better for the sadhaka of the integral yoga to unite the two movements. And so we come now to this practice. We've seen that we can enter the self first and then gradually turn upon the world, bit by bit re-engage and accept everything into the oneness of the self, and then even cultivate the mind, accustom it to dwelling on the underlying sense of the one. We could go all the way and turn upon, or, he says, we can do both at the same time. A movement towards self, and then a movement turning upon underlying this, on the underlying sense of the oneness. Yet in fact, it is better for the sadhaka of the integral yoga to unite the two movements. Now, how exactly are we going to unite the two movements is the theme of the rest of the chapter. And here he will be discussing all three realizations which have been covered. The perception of everything existing in the oneness of self, the perception of the self living in all things, in all forms, and perception of the self as the expression of all things. These are the three realizations which we have to have, through which we will re-establish the right relationship with the world. For each of these, there is a complete paragraph dedicated to the particular form of the practice and means. But now he's leading towards that. But by one, he will find the self within. By the other, he will find that self in all that seems to us at present to be outside us. So two movements have to be practiced. a movement of going within. At first, we may do it exclusively. I focus on this for several days at a time. And once having attained to some degree of depth of interiorization, from there now I turn upon the world and begin to see the sense of the self, the one, in the triple way. Or I may concentrate on this outer movement, the self in all things, the self holding, embracing all things, and so on. And then from there gradually turn inwards and know the same self as within me. One movement will lead this way, the other movement the other way. It is possible indeed to begin with the latter movement, that is, you start with the outer perception. To realize all things in this visible and sensible existence as God or Brahman or Virat Purusha, and then to go beyond to all that is behind the Virata. But this has its inconveniences, and it is better, if that be found possible, to combine the two movements. So just as you could exclusively go within and then turn upon the world, you could exclusively turn outward and then go to some deeper truth. But he says that has inconveniences. He doesn't speak of it too much. There are many practices or many lineages in which this outward look is much more the focus. In the Zen tradition, for example, that is the first focus. And the turning within is, at least initially, almost incidental, varying in schools. And so you try constantly, while in the midst of life, to establish this voice of not being affected by things and to dwell always on the idea of the underlying reality, of the underlying oneness in whatever vocabulary is used. And so even in the meditation practice, you never lose external sight. You may briefly let your eyes half close, but never fully close. You do not want to get into some fantasy of the mind's creation. And that being the fear, you retain always your link with the surface appearance of things. And there are other such traditions where the whole focus is on the perception of the divine in form, through form, in nature. One of the forms you will see in the practices of many tribes that live in forests, they pursue this approach. The inconvenience or the risk there is that you very quickly attach yourself to the form. You never get the opportunity to go beyond, because you've always associated this presence or this perception of the spirit with the form. Yes, there is a spirit which is beyond the form also, but that is somewhat vague. You are unable to free yourself from the form of spirit or spirit being attached to form always. In one of the meetings which I had been to, there was a leader of the Native American tradition, and at the beginning of the meeting he did a kind of an invocation, and then afterwards he said to me, "Could you feel that? All the spirits came rushing in." And it was interesting to see that his idea was spirits in plural. They needed to come here. They were not here, they were elsewhere. So obviously he is not seeing the underlying self, not the underlying oneness, not the spirit. So I tried to engage in conversation to understand what was the framework in which he worked. And I discovered that he actually had this concept of the great spirit, a kind of an underlying one spirit But somehow that was not the prominent thing. The spirits and the relationship with spirits was more real, more accessible. Great Spirit was something vague and distant. It's there, but it was not the immediate focus. And one can see how one could easily entangle oneself in something which is not the highest liberation. And that whole thing has been dealt with earlier in previous chapters, we need not repeat. Unless we can get into the realization of the Absolute, one will always fall short somewhere. And there can be, as Sri Aurobindo pointed out earlier, even the possibility of an exaggeration of the ego in a partial realization. So there are many aspects to this question of starting with the movement of the perception of oneness everywhere first. But he says it is better, if that is found possible, to combine the two movements. And then they become complementary. We have a steady progression in our experience, always growing to deeper and truer and wider freedom of consciousness. So now, how this is to be done? How are we to put into practice these two movements in a combined way? And for the three experiences which are to be realized, and the next 3 paragraphs will cover this. So first, this realization of all things as God or Brahman has, as we have seen, 3 aspects, of which we can conveniently make 3 successive stages of experience. So we're going to look at all 3. Just before we dwell on that, in the portion we just read, you will see he uses certain words. To realize all things in this visible and sensible existence as God or Brahman or Virat Purusha, and then to go beyond to all that is behind the Virat. Now he has used or, meaning they are different. You can concentrate on God, it's different from concentrating on Brahman, different from concentrating on Virat Purusha, and then to go beyond the Virat. So, before we proceed with the text, it's important to always pause and review why he is using these words. What's the difference? In fact, they represent 3 different relationships that we can have with the sense of the oneness or the divine in the world. God is a personality. We are entering in relation with the divine, the personality, with whom we can have a personal relationship, with whom we can even have a relationship of prayer as much as of worship, of affection, and so on, of love. So the possibility of the relationship is much more prominent when we look upon this underlying oneness as God, as a conscious being. And the relationship, depending on various traditions or one's temperament, could be one of friend, of beloved, of father, of guru, of child, of a player who's playing a game with us, mischievous child, as with the baby Krishna, and so on. Inevitably, in every religion that approaches the divine in this way, as a personality, you will find all of these eventually explored, if the religion has been in existence long enough. In the Vaishnava tradition, you have Sri Krishna, who is the teacher as a guru. He instructs you. When you read the Bhagavad Gita, he is telling you here, he is revealing you to you and leading you to an experience. Or it is the child Krishna, who is playing mischief with you, who is hiding things, and towards whom you are like a mother. Or it is Sri Krishna as the beloved. He's an equal, but somehow he's the Lord to whom you belong. And you are in the spirit of the gopis, the gopi bhava. The relationship of your soul is the feminine relationship to the Lord, who is the master, the masculine relationship. In the Sufi tradition, similarly, you will find this. Every soul is seen as female, the Lord is the male. In the Christian tradition, you will have infant Jesus, or Jesus presides over the whole world, or you have the relationship of him as the teacher. Various aspects developed especially in different lineages or traditions. And the human nature, each human nature being distinct, finds one of these to be closer to their natural temperament, and they tend therefore to be drawn to this or that variation of lineage or tradition within the larger religious movement. In the Buddhist tradition, the relationship with the Buddha as a child I have not yet seen. But I can imagine that there might have been at some point some practices. But it is not going to happen naturally, because the focus in Buddhist tradition is much more on the absolute. And there you cannot reduce the absolute to a personality and then make the personality a child. At best, it is a personality that from the poise of the absolute turns to the world with compassion. That becomes the Amitabha Buddha. As he is on the brink of merging in the absolute, he briefly looks back and looks at the whole world in immense suffering. And he vows not to cross the line until the whole world is taken with him. And so that poise is frozen in permanence, because it is from a poise of timeless, spaceless, absolute consciousness, turning to gaze upon space and time and the multiplicity of suffering creatures. And so you relate to the Amitabha Buddha as the master of compassion and ask his help to heal your suffering and your pain. And there's the 1,000-armed Buddha. He is everywhere, present everywhere, immanent. But very difficult to reduce that to a personality that can be for you a child or a lover. So you don't find that in the Buddhist tradition, at least I have never seen it. And so this other aspect of the divine, when we focus more on the absolute rather than personality, that is the next phrase he uses. God or Brahman. So in the concept of Brahman, there is this transcendence. And the transcendence may include the immanence, or it may turn away. And that depends on the two major variations you find in the tradition. In the Buddhist tradition, you have the Mahayana and the Hinayana. They don't like the word Hinayana because the word says inferior. Hina is inferior, lower path. So they call it Theravada. Mahayana is the greater path. What's the difference? Primarily, it is this aspect. In the Theravada tradition, the aspect of exclusive focus on the absolute beyond the world and losing yourself in it is made the center. In the Mahayana, you recognize the absolute, but also its multiplicity in expression, and you have all the deities and forms and aspects of the Buddha, whatever name you may give to them, and you can relate to each of them. And so you have the particular aspect of the Buddha which presides over this operation in the cosmos, another which presides over that. They are all aspects of the Buddha with special names, but they're still the same absolute. And that comes very close to the original Vedic concept of all what we call gods, devas, as aspects and powers of the one divine. But in this, you can have many relationships. The disadvantage, you can lose yourself in those relationships. And you can forget that you have to get to the absolute beyond them all. But this, you see, even in the approach to Brahman, you have an exclusive world renouncing or an immanence of the Absolute in the world and a multiplicity therefore, both would come under the general category of Brahman. So when you concentrate on the idea that all this is God, there's a personality, oh, this is the smile of Sri Krishna. Oh, that is Sri Krishna blowing the wind. The lightning is him playing in the clouds. I'm going to see everything in terms of that. The world itself is his body. When I shift the perspective to Brahman, then it is much more impersonal. I do not have that personal relationship so obviously. It is this vast immensity of the one divine presence transcending the world, presiding over it from that transcendence and pouring to fill and form the world. But the transcendence is its greater reality, and I look towards that in awe, wonder. And I see all these movements, cosmic, universal, massive, across space, across time, one Brahman. And so when I look at the flower, it is one Brahman presenting to me this special face of flower. I look at the dog, it is one Brahman appearing to me in this form. Everything is form and play of Brahman in Brahman. But you see, much more impersonal, majestic, large. Or, he says, or Virat Purusha. And this is something very interesting. It now takes one aspect of the Brahman. In the earlier discussions, we have touched upon this. The Brahman takes up 4 poises. They are all Brahman. There is the poise where he is completely expressed in form that is objectively experienced. All of us can see this as flower. We have a sense of clear separation of form. All of us can observe it distinctly, separately, and agree to it. But there is a poise which is more subjective, not so objective, as when we enter in our dream state. And in the subtle worlds, perhaps to me this appearance appears like a flower, to someone else it may appear as something else. Because the reality is not the form, but the flow of the energy, or the idea behind the flow of energy. And so we can perceive it differently. And so there is not the same sense of shared reality. Your perception of reality and my perception can be very different, although we are still looking at the same thing. This is what happens, of course, when we see things emotionally or with the mind and not with the physical senses only. We remember events much more differently. In that domain, which is described as the dream state, this is described as the waking state of Brahman, that is dream state. And then beyond that, at the causal level, before the forms are put out, where all is held in potential, is described as the sleep state. And then there is the transcendence beyond that. Each of these is given a name in Sanskrit. All 4 together are the totality of Brahman. But any one of these we can dwell upon as Brahman. Virata is the name given to the open, physical, wide, objective experience of Brahman. Virat, literally the name means vast, immense, massive. Purusha, being, person. So it is this vast being, vast person that is the universe. And this corresponds to people who approach the perception of oneness through the physical mind and the physical senses. The reality of higher worlds, higher gradations of consciousness, things experienced in subtler, inner trance states is not there for them. They start with, this is all I know. And here I look upon the oneness of the universe. And this is very popular currently in a lot of the New Age teachings, because then you don't have to get into abstractions that cannot be validated. You don't need any religious beliefs or formations. And so it's very secular, practical, materialistic, convenient to the physical mind. And for people who do not have any deeper experience, it's a good starting point. And so they will use the word, a vocabulary that goes something like, when you ask for something intensely, the universe listens to you and responds. What is this, the universe? If you ask yourself, who in the universe listens? Why does it bother to respond to you? You're implying that the universe is alive, it is conscious, and if it's listening to your desire as much as to somebody else's desire, then it is everywhere, and it is conscious everywhere. What are you speaking of? Conscious being. That is substance of the universe, and which is also substance of things you do not see. Finally, you're aiming at the same idea. But rather than declaring that there is this immense reality which I cannot see, I stop short at a surface appearance, use a few words which conceal what is beyond, and satisfy myself that I have got to some truth, great truth. So the universe listens to you, and they will, in one of the very popular teachings which is presented as the secret, they say, the whole universe will bend over backwards to fulfill your desire if you ask it. And so the method taught is you have to formulate your desire and call it out to the universe and tell the universe you want this. And you say, I want a fancy car. And the next day in front of your house you will have a fancy car because the universe will bend over backwards to give it to you. Of course it doesn't work like that. But what are you doing? You're looking at a personality, a being, Purusha, who is immense, vast, Virat. But physical, material. You do not have to believe anything beyond that. God, divine, spirit, self, absolute, none of that is required. It's all very tangible, material. And you tell it. You don't have to pray, you just have to ask, demand, but with focused intensity. And it will grant it. It happens almost mechanically, like a machinery. And yet it's listening to you and granting you, taking trouble. So it's a bit of a mixed idea, but convenient for someone who's very physically grounded. And so, Virat Purusha. And you can dwell on it this way. You recall I had shared with you the example of somebody I met who was looking at himself and life as the universe would be looking at it. And that was his theme for meditation. And it was very beautiful to meet him in that state. And the practice would simply be this. The whole universe, the whole galaxy and all the galaxies, they are watching you, let's say. Watching your life, watching your situation, watching you lift this flower, smell it, pluck it from the tree, place it in a vase. And you try to see all this as they would be seeing, as the universe as a whole would be looking at it. And then when you say, oh, this person did not smile at me, that person spoke a word which was rude, you see how trivial is that? In the totality of the universe, it's such a small ripple, so irrelevant. And it doesn't matter. The universe, and now I can project onto it whatever I want, the universe is happy. The universe is complete. The universe is abundant. I too should be like the universe, happy, complete, abundant. And so I throw away all these clouds, shadows, not relevant. Here is this vast one, Virat, Purusha. But if you stop there, you've missed things which you're already suggesting in your own relationship, but you refuse to see directly. So then beyond you must go, and then to go beyond to all that is behind the Virat. That must be done later. And generally, if you have been in this long enough, you'll begin to sense and perceive those things. So, the full sentence we reread, now you see how much he is capturing in this. It is possible indeed to begin with the latter movement, to realize all things in this visible and sensible existence as God or Brahman or Virat Purusha, and then to go beyond to all that is behind the Virat. So your focus was the sensible physical experience. You must necessarily go beyond after that. But this has inconveniences, and it is better if that is found possible to combine the two movements. So we come to the text now. This realization of all things as God or Brahman, and he doesn't use the word Virat anymore. This realization of all things as God or Brahman has, as we have seen, three aspects, of which we can conveniently make three successive stages of experience. Now in our practice, we are going to practice the first, and then the second, and then the third in succession. It may happen though, that between the first and the second, we may find one of these more convenient, so we may change the order between the first and second, but eventually we will do the other, and then the third follows. The third comes naturally when the first two have been realized. First is seeing all things inside the oneness, inside the Brahman, like fish in the water. So this flower, like fish floating in the water, the ocean of self, of oneness, of Brahman, of the divine consciousness. Everything is seen like this, floating inside. I am right now floating in this one Brahman. I breathe the air, but I breathe in equally Brahman. And so on. The second experience is seeing Brahman in all things, seeing the divine in all things. Oh, this flower is filled with the presence. The presence is playing here, enjoying itself, as in there, as in there, as in there. And the third is to see all things as expressions of the divine. The flower is the smile of the divine taking physical form and expressing itself. And according to the mood and vibration of his joy, of the smile, we have different forms and fragrances and colors of the flowers. Each is capturing something of his joy expressed. When the first two are established, the third becomes almost natural and inevitable. Between the first two, we may find one of them easier to start with. Sri Aurobindo takes this first one as all things floating in Brahman as our first step. You could start the other way and say Brahman in all things, and then when all things have Brahman in them, you begin to awaken to the common presence of Brahman. And then you begin to see all things floating in the Brahman. If you start the other way, you see all this floating in the same oneness, and then that oneness is equally inside as it is outside. The fish is constantly drinking the water in which it lives. The water flows through it. It is formed out of that water. And so one leads to the other. First, and this is the theme of the whole paragraph, we will read a little bit and leave the rest for next time. First, there is the self in whom all beings exist. The spirit, the divine, has manifested itself as infinite self-extended being. He has become this spread out being. Self-existent, pure, not subject to time and space, supporting time and space as figures of its consciousness. It is more than all things and contains them all within that self-extended being and consciousness. Not bound by anything that it creates, holds or becomes, but free and infinite and all blissful. It holds them in the old image as the infinite ether contains in itself all objects. This image of the ethereal Akasha, Brahman, may indeed be of great practical help to the sadhaka who finds a difficulty in meditating on what seems to him at first an abstract and unseizable idea. So what is the abstract, unseizable idea? The divine as self-existent, extended being, not subject to time and space. Oops. How do you get out of time and space? I can't conceive of that. But I can conceive of his extension inside time and space, like an ocean, like an ether, filling everything. That is possible. So that's what he is pointing to first, as a practical starting point. But from there you must get to that which is behind space and time, beyond space and time, unaffected, unchanged by everything happening in space and time. Then only you are coming to the real sense of self. In the image of the ether, not physical, but an encompassing ether of vast being, consciousness and bliss. He may seek to see, that is the sadhaka, he may seek to see with the mind and to feel in his mental being this supreme existence and to identify it in oneness with the self within him. This I perceive in my mind everywhere, and within me I am one with that. I am that. So first you focus on the seeing everywhere. If you like the ether image, fluid filling everything, pure consciousness, bliss, but free from all things, all forms. And then that is inside me equally, and I am actually that in my truth. Because the fish is formed out of the water, in truth, it is the water. My body and mind are formed out of that. I am that in truth. And then gradually you free even from the idea of this thing filling space and time, but it is much more outside space and time and free of space and time. And there's a sense of something transcending, breaking free, breaking out. So start with the first, everywhere around you. Then the same thing within you, and you identify with it, I am that. And then the whole thing breaking out. Or some combination of these three. By such meditation, the mind may be brought to a favorable state of predisposition, in which, by the rending or withdrawing of the veil, the supramental vision may flood the mentality and change entirely all our seeing. And then from there we become more and more that, which we won't read now. So when the mind is thus brought into a favorable state, it is predisposed, you're seeing this, you're feeling it in your mind, you're identifying with it, then the greater truth beyond can enter, as if tearing the veil and flood your whole being. It may happen gradually. It tears the veil and a little bit leaks through, and a little bit more, and a little bit more, and gradually this thing becomes more and more vivid, more and more real, and you feel yourself more and more free and wide, and or it may come in a sudden rush and suddenly you're thrown into this immense experience. But of course that passes also quickly. Whichever way, we don't worry too much. As we create the right condition, that will happen. The experience will fill more and more concretely. And it will be from above. It's waiting, it's already there. We in that state are experiencing it, and now we in this state have to receive the experience. That will be our conviction. And then he says, we shall be in our self-consciousness not so much cosmic as ultra-cosmic, infinite, even as if standing behind, beyond cosmos. Mind and life and body will then be only movements in that infinity which we have become. And we shall see that what exists is not world at all, but simply this infinity of spirit in which move the mighty cosmic harmonies of our own images of self-conscious becoming. So that is the degree to which it will go. We leave it at this for now, and we have a practical form in which to apply this text as a practice, which we will take this occasion to develop over the next few weeks. And we will continue the study of this text after a gap of about 1 month, because I will have to be out of station from next week. And we will resume this on the 10th of December. I'm sorry. So I will back on the 26th, but that is a Saturday, so we missed 25th. And the Friday after I have to be out of station. So we'll have to continue this on the Friday of December, 9th of December. 9th of December we will continue this. But we will have the Sunday class in November, which will be November 27th. So as such, the classes will resume on November 27th from the Sunday. But the Friday it will be December of 9th. We can pause here and take up any questions or comments. Next Friday. There's no class, but for those who are interested, we will be showing videos of some of the earlier classes as well as some of the lectures which I had delivered during the travels, and some of them may be of interest to you. So that will be at the same time on Friday. Yes.
So because
Yes.
I would like to ask you to repeat the difference between God and Brahma. Because I understood when you explained about God, but after when you wanted to explain about the Brahma, I didn't really
Okay.
understand the difference.
So the difference between God and Brahman, in God the emphasis is on the personality. In Brahman the emphasis is on the impersonality. It is the entire, the all, the vastness, the transcendence beyond space and time, impersonally holding everything. But you do not have anymore the sense of a personality who is consciously relating to you. It is the universe seen in its totality. It is cosmos seen in totality and transcending cosmos and so on.
So he is taking,
It's just the emphasis is different.
he is taking the God as in the religion.
God, whenever you use the word God, it's always a personality where you have a relationship. The religions give that relationship a narrow focus.
Okay, because in the written of Sri Aurobindo, the life of God, and he is often used the God.
Yes.
So we have to understand this always like this.
Yes. Whenever he uses 2 or 3 words, we must pause and consider what they represent. Sometimes God may be used generally to represent all of these, or Brahman may be used generally to represent all of these. But when he puts them next to each other, he is deliberately trying to emphasize this. Or in the context, he may be discussing in the bhakti discussions of devotion, it will be much more the personality aspect. You will not hear the word Brahman appearing. You will have God, divine, Purusha, these terms representing an individual personality that you relate to.
But if you use God alone,
If he uses God alone, it has this aspect of personality and relationship. Yes. Sri Aurobindo uses these words very carefully, very precisely. I have, in our study earlier, in a text of Sri Aurobindo written in Sanskrit, which has been published under the title of Sri Aurobindo Upanishad, the Sanskrit Sri Aurobindo uses 3 or 4 words describing the divine. So he uses the word Bhagavan, which specifically means the divine enjoyer. Or he uses the word Purusha, which represents the aspect of person. Or he uses the word Brahman. And so various terms like that in Sanskrit. But in the publication of the translation which you have in English, the translator has compressed all of them into one word, God, or divine, I don't remember what. And so this distinction is lost. That's an error of the translator. Yes. But I give this example. Yes. So when Sri Aurobindo writes, you have to consider why this word. And always there's a good reason. I gave this example of how in the translation, the translator has flattened the meaning completely. And he uses different words in the context. And when the whole text changes and the focus is on the divine enjoying the world, it is always Bhagavan, the enjoyer, the divine as enjoyer. Isha is another term, Lord, Ishvara, Lord. So in Sanskrit, the words are so distinct, you cannot mix up easily. And yet, because the person translating, in his mind, never made these distinctions, he blurs it and flattens it. It was translated by an academic, so. So when the Buddhist says no God, no self, they're right in that perspective. But if you say Brahman, it corresponds to the Buddhist idea, Buddhist conception. You've just removed the personality aspect and you're looking at it as an impersonal, one whole. So we have a very important form given to the practice, and there are two ways in which you can do it. One is you do it as a walking meditation. You go into a space, let's say walking on the beach road, walking on the terrace where you have a large open space, walking in a garden where you will not be easily disturbed or distracted from your concentration. And then you dwell on this idea of the one self-extended, supporting everything. Bring it within you equally and then identifying with it. And in this way, you remain for a while. Later you will find, after a few days, when you complete that concentration, you turn to your normal activities, something of this will remain as a backdrop. And then you can, in the midst of activities, pause, bring back this perception, and then continue the activity. Take a break, rest, come back to rest in this idea, and then go back. This is one form in which you can take it up. The other is to start with focus on something small, like the flower. Even if you're walking in the garden, rather than having this vast sense, you focus on the flower, focus on the tree, focus on the form. But bring this idea that there is this underlying one reality, presence, self, supporting from behind. We're not yet focusing on the presence inside. Even if you see that, it's all right. But bring this idea around little things. And then gradually the whole thing joins, and then there is this vast, which includes all these things. Whichever way you find easier, you just let the experience lead. But spending time in it, even for short durations, and frequent short durations in the day, would be even more effective. But at least once a day, if we can do that, we will find that it takes very quickly a concrete reality and begins to change us, and then begins to change our behavior automatically. So he says, and upon that change of seeing, as it becomes more and more potent and insistent and occupies all our consciousness, there will supervene eventually a change of becoming. So that what we see, we become. And so that thing just begins to fill you and mold you from inside and shape your behavior. Your behavior and your identity undergoes a change. Very practical and accessible exercise for all of us. And we'll continue the text after a month. Oh.